This is the first of 4 videos dealing with population geography, and what I would like all of you to be reading is Chapter 2 in the textbook. For this particular video, what you might want to do is focus specifically on pages 46 through 50, and then also pages 54 through 55. However, I do want you to read the whole chapter, as we will get to the rest of those pages as we go through each one of the following 3 videos after this one. So let's start out with the objectives for this video. There are 2. I would like all of you to be able to identify what we're going to call the 3 big population cores. The second is we are going to move on to the first of 4 demographic markers, and the one that we will explore in this particular video is something called the CBR, which stands for the crude birth rate. Let's begin. The question that I would like to address is basically the geography of the population distribution currently. And there are roughly 7 billion people who live on planet Earth right now, but guess what? They are not uniformly distributed. There is, in fact, a pattern, and that pattern is characterized by its highly uneven nature, which is basically another way of saying that the 7 billion people who live on planet Earth today live in very special places where there is a high concentration of the human population. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to identify the 3 most significant areas of high population density, and then what we're going to do is we're going to call these areas or conceptualize these areas as population cores. So what we mean by a population core is an area, a region, that is also a formal region, that is characterized by consistently high population density. So let's move on. What are the 3 most significant, most populous population core areas? I've got them represented right here, and they're ranked from the number 1 position to the number 2 position to the number 3 position. The most significant, or most populous, if you want to put it that way, population core area is East Asia. East Asia has roughly 1.6 billion people, and what it includes is the eastern 1/2 of China, both Koreas, that means both North and South Korea, and also Japan. Notice that these population core areas don't necessarily correspond perfectly to countries. We're not including the entire country of China, but just the eastern 1/2. And that is because the western 1/2 of China, kind of like the western 1/2 of the United States, is characterized by relatively low population density. And our definition of a population core area is one that is characterized by consistently high population density. And so we're going to split China in 2. The eastern 1/2 belongs to the East Asian core area, but the western 1/2 does not. Now, the second most important population core is South Asia. Notice that it has almost as many people as East Asia, with 1.4 billion, and it's a little easier to conceptualize because it includes all of these 3 states: all of India, all of Pakistan, and also all of Bangladesh. Collectively, these 3 countries have about 1.4 billion people. And then finally, the third ranked is Europe. Europe has, if you noticed carefully here, a pretty big gap between South Asia and Europe. It's 0.8 billion, or about 800 million is another way of putting that. Now, we're not going to list every single one of the countries that we have in Europe, because that would be a long list with about 35 to 40 countries. So rather what we'll do is we'll just say this: all of Europe, broadly defined, to include parts of the world that are adjacent to Europe, but that aren't always conventionally understood as being a part of Europe. In particular, we also want to include the far western part of Russia, the part of Russia that's immediately adjacent to Europe, and also Turkey. Turkey isn't usually understood as European, but it's close, and it also has really high population density. So we'll put it into the European population core area. Let's move on to a map so that all of you can see this with a somewhat better geographic visualization. Here's a map of the distribution of the human population. Look at the legend first off. Basically, as you move from the gray tone through the green, the orange, the red, the maroon, and the purple, What that represents is higher, progressively higher population density. So the purple and the dark red, or the maroon, represent areas that are characterized by exceptionally high population density. Then, if we look for areas that are basically formal regions, where you have either the maroon and the purple consistently throughout, we'll have basically the three main population cores. So let's start out over here. If you follow my cursor, I'm basically identifying the East Asian population core. Notice that throughout you have either red or purple just about everywhere. And again, the three countries that are a part of the East Asian population core are Japan, the Koreas, right here the Korean Peninsula, and then the eastern one half of China. Nearby, but also separate and distinct, is the South Asian population core area, with India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh rounding out the three states that constitute the South Asian population core. And then finally over here, somewhat more diffuse, and also characterized by somewhat lower population density, is Europe. Europe, of course, is broadly defined to include Turkey as well as the western part of Russia. But notice we're not going to list every single country that constitutes the European population core area, primarily because that list would be very long. Now, there is just one more thing that I want to say about this, and I want to point out what these three population core areas all have in common. The first is going to seem like somewhat of a surprise. I want to make the argument that Europe, South Asia, and East Asia are technically all on the same continent, because they are. If you notice, Europe and Asia are not separated by a large body of water. Conventionally, of course, we think of Europe as a separate continent, but it's not. The correct term for this continent right here is Eurasia. And all three, East Asia, South Asia, and Europe, are found on the Eurasian landmass. So one way of thinking about it then is that East Asia is the far eastern part of the Eurasian landmass, South Asia is the southern part of the Eurasian landmass, and Europe is basically the far western part of the Eurasian landmass. Now what this means is that if you have the three most significant population core areas on one continent, that one continent is pretty important with regard to the overall population distribution. In fact, it is this 75% roughly of the total human population lives on just that one continent of Eurasia. So 3 out of every 4 humans alive today live on just one continent. Perhaps a somewhat more important point, though, is this. Another common thread that the 3 population core areas have is they're all technically in the mid-latitudes, which basically just means they're not near the equator, nor are they near the polar regions. It turns out that East Asia, China, and some of the neighboring countries are all mid-latitude. Europe is certainly mid-latitude. South Asia, with India in particular, might maybe be understood as subtropical, but it's still basically mid-latitude. And that speaks to a larger issue, and that is this. The mid-latitudes turn out to be really ideal locations for high population density because they are ideal locations for agriculture. And it's agriculture that basically supports population densities that are high. It's agriculture that supports big cities. And in fact, a lot of the world's largest cities are found in these 3 main population core areas. Okay, let's move on. We have exactly one more thing that we will do in today's video lecture, or in this particular video lecture, I should say, and that is I want to move on to one of the 4 demographic markers. What we mean by a demographic marker is one of the ways that demographers measure certain attributes of population and population change. The one that we'll talk about today is called the crude birth rate, sometimes abbreviated, especially for me in the 4 lectures that I'll give you with respect to this module, as the CBR. So if you hear me say CBR, it basically is shorthand for the crude birth rate. Now, there's 2 more things we need to talk about before we turn our attention to this map. I need all of you to understand how the crude birth rate is measured. And the way that it's measured is consistent. It's always measured the same way. It's always measured as births per 1,000 people per year. And then we have a resulting number that we can use in doing a cross-country comparison. One other thing I want you to notice before we turn to the map is that the crude birth rate is sometimes also referred to as the fertility rate. But to be consistent, I will always refer to the crude birth rate as the crude birth rate so that I don't confuse any of you. Now, let's turn our attention to the map. And the first thing we need to look at is the legend. Notice in the legend here that we have 4 categories, represented by an intensification of the color green. So the dark green represents the highest crude birth rates. The light green, or almost a gray really, represents the lowest. Look in particular at the numbers. The way that we're going to talk about it is as follows. This darkest green category, which represents a crude birth rate of 40 and above, we're going to call that a high crude birth rate. So to give just one example, the country of Madagascar, the country of Somalia, the country of Afghanistan, all of them are color-coded with the dark green, and what that means is they have a crude birth rate that's greater than 40 births per 1,000 people per year. And that means, in the way we're going to talk about it, they have a high crude birth rate. Now, the middle 2 categories, 20 all the way up to basically 39, we're going to call those a moderate crude birth rate. So to give an example, Mexico and Bolivia both fall into these 2 categories respectively, so they must have crude birth rates between 20 and 39, and thus, in the way we will talk about it, a moderate crude birth rate. Finally, the lightest color tone, the kind of very light green or even gray, for example, Argentina and also the United States, below 20, what that means for us is they have a low crude birth rate. So just to summarize, high, these 2 are moderate, and then finally the lowest category we will call low. Now, in the next slide, we're going to relate the crude birth rate to levels of wealth, and therefore we're going to talk about this geographic pattern with a little bit more clarity and finesse. But just to kind of foreshadow where we're going to go, the crude birth rate is almost always inversely related to wealth. The wealthier the country, the lower the crude birth rate. The poorer the country, the higher the crude birth rate.